Our theme this month is compassion. Next week we'll talk about humanism and compassion, humanism's notion that we can be good without God. And the week after that we'll talk about the science of compassion, but it seems fitting to me that we kick off this theme talking about mental health. Over our lifetimes, we're all likely to benefit from a more compassionate societal approach to the treatment of mental illness and mental health in general, since in a given year, 1 in 4 people are affected by a mental health challenge, either in their own lives or in the life of a family member. Still, there's sometimes such stigma attached to mental health issues that many people are hesitant to be honest about their struggles. We've just come through the month of May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so I want to talk this morning about some of the struggles of those dealing with behavioral or mental health issues in general and here in Arizona, and what Unitarian Universalism might be calling us to do. This topic was purchased at a recent auction, but it's close to my heart too. I'm a former vice president of a chapter of Mental Health America, and I have sometimes dealt with depression. People in my family have sometimes dealt with depression and other mental health struggles and mental illness. The Unitarian Universalism struggle with mental health in the United States goes way back. One of the most prominent figures in the history of advocacy for fair treatment of the mentally ill in our country was the 19th century Unitarian Dorothea Dix. Dix was a teacher who was invited to teach a course at one point in her life at a prison. She was horrified by what she found at that unheated facility. The mentally ill, she said, were housed right alongside criminals she called them hardened criminals, who had committed horrific acts. The mentally ill were often kept nude and beaten into submission by the guards. She secured a court order to force some improvements, including providing heat for the prisoners, but it seems Dorothea Dix was most upset over the mentally ill being housed alongside criminals, alongside felons. So she read and she interviewed and she studied and she became a leading expert in mental illness. She visited jails all over her home state of Massachusetts, then in New York and New Jersey, Pennsylvania. An autobiography of hers, of Dorothea Dix, says, she found the mentally ill chained in cellars, living in accumulations of their own excrement and often suffering from the cold. Most jails and almhouses were poorly ventilated. They seldom provided proper nutrition or exercise. She was often so nauseated by the smells that she had to go outside a bit to recover her composure. Though jailers and proprietors of almhouses often tried to prevent her from seeing their worst cases, she demanded and usually received full access. She said, "I cannot adopt description of the condition of the insane secondarily. What I assert, I must see for myself." So she petitioned legislatures and she saw the construction of about 30 hospitals intended to keep the mentally ill out of prisons. The Civil War eventually depleted the funding for her work, but Dix laid an important foundation for change in the way people in the U.S. treat the mentally ill, people with behavioral health challenges. Today, those with mental health challenges are not chained and beaten as they were perhaps in Dix's day. We've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. One of the biggest problems is that the mentally ill are, in fact, often still housed alongside violent criminals. The difficulty of present-day treatment of persons with mental health challenges is illustrated by the story of Patton Bluff. Patton was in his mid-20s, and in his mid-20s felt that he had everything he wanted out of life. He had a thriving business. He was married with 2 children at the time who loved him. Life seemed absolutely perfect, but in 2002, things started to fall apart for him. He had a manic episode in which he became ecstatic, then paranoid, He had another episode, then another in the coming months. Eventually, his wife could take no more and left him. He was diagnosed and medicated, but the medicine only worked for a while. The National Alliance for Mental Illness, or NAMI, reports that people in mental health crisis are more likely to encounter police than to get medical help. In fact, 15% of men and 30% of women, they say, booked into jail have a serious mental health condition. As a result, 2 million people with mental illness are booked into jails each year. That's just what happened to Patton. As part of his business, he was working on a $2.6 million portion of the cleanup after Hurricane Katrina when he had another manic episode. He describes it in detail this way. I thought there was an entire good old boy network out to get me after I had accused government officials of fraud in regards to the FEMA-backed cleanup contracts. One minute, he says, I was so high that my body and mind entered a nirvana-like state with feelings of ultimate power and supreme authority. And then in the next minute, I felt so paranoid and scared that I thought my heart would thump out of my chest. The mania escalated to the level that I believed, he said, a police officer was trying to pull me over to murder me. I took the police on a high-speed chase and was arrested for the first time in my life. A couple of days later, I believed I was waging nuclear war with China and President Bush was obeying my signals from my jail cell. I thought a microchip was implanted in my lung and the evil forces of the government were trying to control my actions. I was eventually placed in a mental health hospital and remained there for nearly a month. And he concludes this part of his story. My stay in jail and the hospital set off a chain of events that ended in financial ruin, losing contact with my children, having my house foreclosed on. I spent a third of the next 3 years behind bars or in the hospital. Tried every medication in the book, but started to rapid cycle, experiencing a manic high every 6 months, alternating with depression. I would experience severe delusional paranoia during the high times, and every time the police confronted me, I was convinced they were there to kill me." End quote. Patton was in and out of jail, arrested 6 times for misdemeanors. But jail is no place for a person with mental illness. As NAMI reports, the vast majority of individuals in jail are not violent criminals. Most of the people in jails haven't yet gone to trial, so they're not yet convicted of a crime. The rest are serving short sentences for minor crimes. Once they're in jail, most people don't get the treatment they receive and end up getting worse, not better. They stay longer than their counterparts without mental illness. They're at risk of victimization, and often their mental health conditions get worse. After leaving jail, a lot of them don't have access to needed health care and benefits. And after, a criminal record makes it harder for individuals to get a job or housing. Many people, especially without access to mental health services and supports, wind up homeless in emergency rooms, then are rearrested. At least 83% of jail inmates with a mental illness don't have access to treatment. Jailing people with mental illness creates huge burdens on law enforcement, corrections, and state budgets. It doesn't protect public safety, and people who could be helped are being ignored. Patton Bluff was convicted of 2 felonies during his jail time for spitting on and threatening guards. But it was a jail program that Patton credits with saving his life. He attended a talk by a NAMI representative and came to understand his own disorder more fully, how to deal with his diagnosis with medicine combined with other interventions, including therapy. Here's the end of his story. He says that slowly the shame and guilt that he had felt about his illness was removed, and the shame and guilt that he felt over his criminal record was removed, because he said he came to see his illness as a medical problem, not bad character. Then he learned about the crisis intervention team that NAMI offers to police and first responders. NAMI Greenville allowed him to share his stories of police interacting with him and things ending badly, at the 40-hour class. He says, when I present, I want the officers to understand just how bizarre psychosis can be. I go into detail about how your head gets to that point. He says, there are so many people who have had this happen to them and don't want to talk about it. I tell them that when they don't undermine another person's truth, they have a better chance of de-escalating the situation. I remember my paranoid delusions, and through the support of my second wife and my NAMI family, I've discovered the importance of sharing my story on an honest level. My favorite story of his is his presenting to a group of 30 officers a few years ago who gave him a standing ovation at the end of his class. And he said that one of the officers who had previously arrested him was in that class and hugged him in front of everyone. He says, since that time, I've been proudly involved with the training of more than 250 officers. I talked last week about considering mercy when making laws. Patton's story makes me wonder, what could happen if instead of building another prison, we funneled even a portion of that $1.5 billion we're going to spend over the next 20 years to keep up the latest private prison in Arizona toward researching and treating mental illness? How much pressure would that relieve from the police and the justice system? Would it have the effect that the construction of a prison is intended to have? Increased safety. There's one exciting program in Yuma that is making that attempt. Officials there have created what they call the mental health court. Arrestees with mental health issues are guided toward treatment rather than jail even before their sentencing. The Arizona chapter of NAMI reports that it's working so well that the court is widening its service area from Yuma to the county. There's also legislation in Congress right now entitled the Comprehensive Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Act, which would provide help for law enforcement programs, state and local, in addition to correctional training, jail division, and community reentry programs. Jim Dunn, who's the director of Arizona NAMI, says he's optimistic about the future of mental health care in Arizona. He was interviewed recently on NPR. He said local police and other officials are now inviting mental health care folks to the table. He said that's a new thing in his experience. He's hopeful that the recent expansion of Medicaid in Arizona will, he said, help preclude people from getting their treatment in jails and emergency rooms. And he reminds us, it's not just the scary-looking dude on the corner or the homeless person. It's the doctors and the lawyers and the teachers. You'd be amazed, he said, at the people who are leading very full and satisfying lives and successful in spite of having a behavioral health or a mental health diagnosis. I know statistics say many of us here this morning are struggling with these issues. Now, maybe you're not likely to end up in jail, but you're struggling nonetheless. If you need support, please contact me, go to NAMI's website and find a group that's right for you. There's help available if you or a loved one are facing mental health challenges. There are separate support groups for victims and loved ones of victims if you're concerned about that. If you're moved to advocate, go to NAMI's website and read about how to contact your legislator to support the bills that are in Congress now. But maybe most importantly, let us destigmatize mental illness in our time. If we can find the courage, let us talk openly about our own struggles. Let us not pretend to be a part of the great group that has it all together. None of us has it all together. Let us have hearts of compassion for our neighbors and friends and ourselves as we face mental health issues, which are medical conditions. There is help. You are loved. Amen.